Eli guided Darren through the winding halls of the workshop, the walls lined with ancient runes and powerful artifacts, each one humming softly with magic. Darren's gaze swept over the place, a mixture of disbelief and awe slowly settling in as the reality of where he was finally started to sink in. "So, what exactly do you all do here?" Darren asked, his voice laced with sarcasm, but tinged with curiosity. Eli glanced at him, her lips quirking into a smirk. "You know, the usual. Save the world, fight off demonic invasions, heal people who do reckless things, like losing limbs in battle." "Sounds like a regular Tuesday," Darren muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Gunnar really knows how to pick his battles." As they rounded the corner, they entered a large open room filled with weapons, armor, and various tech equipment. A tall, imposing figure stood in the middle of the room, cleaning a sniper rifle with methodical precision. "That's Desera," Eli explained. "She's one of the pack's sharpshooters and tactical geniuses." Desera, noticing the newcomers, looked up from her work and gave Darren a quick once-over. "So, this is the infamous Darren Smith, huh?" Darren raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity of her gaze. "Infamous? That's a new one. I've been called a lot of things, but never that." Desra's lips twitched in what could almost be considered a smile. "Gunnar talks about you. Says you're like a brother." Darren nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, well, we've been through some stuff together." Desera finished cleaning her rifle and stood up, extending a hand. "Desera, I heard you don't believe in the supernatural." Darren shook her hand, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've seen some weird stuff, but magical wolves and elves were a little out of my wheelhouse." Desera chuckled. "Stick around, you'll learn." Eli motioned for Darren to follow her again, and they continued down the hall, passing by a room filled with medical equipment. Inside, Jewel was carefully organizing vials of potions and herbs, her expression calm and focused. "That's Jewel, our medic and healer," Eli said quietly. "She's the one who's been helping Gunnar recover." Jewel looked up, her kind eyes landing on Darren. "You must be Darren. Good to finally meet you." She smiled warmly. "You've got quite the reputation around here." Darren scratched the back of his head, feeling slightly embarrassed by all the attention. "Reputation, huh? Good or bad?" Jewel laughed softly. "Depends on who you ask." Darren glanced around at the array of medical supplies and potions. "You really healed Gunnar with all this stuff?" Jewel nodded. "It's been a team effort. Eli, Clara, and I have done what we can, but Gunnar's been through a lot. Physically, he's healing, but the mental scars, those are harder to treat." Darren's jaw tightened, the weight of what his friend was going through hitting him again. "Yeah, I figured as much." Eli placed a hand on Darren's arm, steering him away from the room and further into the workshop. "Come on, there's more to see." They moved toward the training area, where Clara was sparring with a life-size holographic training dummy. Her movements were swift and precise, every punch and kick executed with deadly efficiency. Darren watched, impressed by her raw strength and skill. "Clara," Eli said, introducing them. "She's the female alpha of the pack." Clara paused her training, wiping sweat from her brow as she looked Darren up and down. Her gaze was sharp, but there was a warmth in her eyes. "So, you're Gunnar's brother-in-arms?" Clara asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Darren gave a small nod. "Yeah, something like that." Clara crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly. "Gunnar's lucky to have you. He won't admit it, but he needs people like you around right now." Darren's gaze drifted toward the ground. "I'll do what I can." Clara gave him a brief nod before turning back to her training, but Darren could tell she was watching him, assessing his every move. As they left the training area, Darren couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief. "I feel like I've stepped into some sort of fantasy novel." Eli smiled, her pointed ears twitching slightly. "Welcome to our world, Darren. It's not exactly what you're used to, but it's real, and we're fighting to keep it safe. Darren sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, I can see that. As they approached the final stop on the tour, the sounds of low growls reached Darren's ears. He tensed slightly, glancing at Eli for an explanation. She grinned. You're about to meet the wolves. They entered a large room where the massive dire wolf, Alpha, and his offspring, Omega, lay resting. Their golden eyes flicked toward Darren as he entered, and the sheer size of Alpha left Darren momentarily speechless. That is a big wolf, Darren muttered, taking a step back. Eli chuckled. That's Alpha, Gunner's spirit animal. The smaller one is Omega. Smaller? Darren raised an eyebrow. That thing could eat a bear. Alpha let out a low, rumbling growl, but there was no malice in it, more of an acknowledgement. Darren, still cautious, kept his distance but couldn't help but feel the gravity of the wolves' presence. So, wolves, magic, demons, elves, Darren said, scratching his head. You guys have a hell of a gig here. Eli nodded, her expression serious. We do. And now that you're here, you're part of it too. Darren glanced back toward where Gunner was resting, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I guess I am. With that, Eli led Darren back toward the center of the workshop, where the rest of the pack was gathered. The tour was over, but Darren's journey into this strange, magical world was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the windows of the workshop, casting long shadows across the floor. Darren stirred in his room, the events of the previous day still swirling in his mind. Wolves, elves, demons. It was a lot to process for someone who had spent his life in the normal human world. He sat up in bed, rubbing his hands over his face when he heard the sound of the door opening. Gunner stepped inside, his frame slightly hunched as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, but his familiar presence was enough to bring a small grin to Darren's face. Gunner closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his one remaining eye focused on Darren. The patch covering the missing eye was a stark reminder of the battles Gunner had fought, and the bandaged stump where his arm once was added to the somber air. Morning, Gunner said in a low, gruff voice, crossing his arms. Morning, Darren replied, sitting up straighter. You look like hell, brother. A small chuckle escaped Gunner's lips as he crossed the room to sit in a chair opposite Darren's bed. Yeah, well, hell's been busy. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a few moments as both men sat, taking in the familiar presence of one another. Darren had missed this, just the simplicity of being around his brother in arms. It was a strange comfort, even in the face of everything going on. Gunner broke the silence first. What did you think of the jet? Darren raised an eyebrow, amused by the question. The jet? Seriously, that thing is like something out of a sci-fi movie. Where the hell did you get that? Gunner leaned back in his chair, his eye narrowing slightly. Classified tech. We've had to make some upgrades given everything. Thought you'd like it. Darren nodded slowly. It's impressive, sleek, fast, vertical takeoff and all. And those electric dirt bikes? Man, I can't wait to get my hands on one of those. But Darren leaned forward slightly, giving Gunner a look. You know that's not what's on my mind. Gunner's jaw clenched slightly as if expecting the shift in conversation. Figured as much. Darren's tone softened. You've got a hell of an operation here, Gunner. I've seen a lot of things, but this. Wolves the size of cars, elves, demons. What the hell did you get yourself into? Gunner took a deep breath, looking away momentarily, his expression hardening. It's a long story, one that I'm still piecing together myself. I'm all ears, brother. But let me ask you this. Why didn't you call me sooner? You should have told me. Gunner's eye flicked back to Darren, his gaze sharp, but filled with something Darren wasn't used to seeing in his old friend. Vulnerability. Because I wasn't sure if you'd believe it. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it at first. Darren leaned back against the bed frame, his arms crossed. Yeah, well, you've got some crazy stuff going on here, but if you're in it, I'm in it. So that question remains. What's the deal? Gunnar shifted in his seat, his mind clearly running through how much to reveal. You know me, Darren. I've always been the one to stand in the way when something needed to be done. When the world turned dark, someone had to fight back. Turns out that darkness isn't just human, it's older, deeper. It's in the things we didn't believe were real. Darren watched his friend closely, reading the weight behind his words. So, what's the plan now? What do you want from me? Gunnar's gaze met his again, more serious than ever. I need you here. There's something coming. I don't know what yet, but it's not over. And I need someone I trust, someone who knows how to fight, to watch my back. This place, this battle, it's more than what I can handle on my own anymore. Darren considered this, his expression softening. You know I've got your back. Always have, always will. But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you keep everything bottled up. I know you, Gunnar. I know when you're holding on to things. Gunnar exhaled, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. I'm trying to figure it out, Darren. Trying to keep it together, but... He glanced at his missing arm and the patch over his eye, then shook his head. It's not easy. Darren's tone turned serious, but there was a hint of the old sarcasm in his voice. Look, you're not done yet. Not by a long shot. Prosthetics, wolves, elves, demons, whatever. We fight. That's who we are, remember? Gunnar's eye held Darren's for a long moment before he nodded, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Yeah, we stand in the dark so others can live in the light. Damn right, Darren said with a grin. And maybe, just maybe, once this is all over, we can get that sleeping bag in heaven. Gunnar chuckled, though it was faint, and leaned back in his chair. You're not wrong about that. Darren studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, his expression softening. Seriously, brother, I'm here. Whatever comes next, we deal with it together. Gunnar nodded, the tension in his shoulders loosening ever so slightly. Thanks, Darren. Darren stood up, giving Gunnar a nod before heading toward the door. Any other questions about the jet? Gunnar shook his head, smirking. Nah, just make sure it's ready when we need it. You got it, Darren replied with a wink before disappearing down the hall. As the door clicked shut behind him, Gunnar let out a long breath, staring at the wall. His old friend was here now. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. As the door clicked shut, Gunnar remained seated, staring into the space where Darren had just been. His presence had brought a momentary calm, a reminder of the brotherhood they'd shared in the military, the sense that no matter how hard things got, someone always had his back. But now that Darren was gone, the familiar weight of isolation began to press down on him again. He clenched his right fist, the one hand he still had, and stared at the bandaged stump where his left arm used to be. The missing limb ached, not physically, but deep inside, as if his body couldn't fully accept the loss. His left eye, once sharp and perceptive, was gone too, replaced by the cold black patch. The damage wasn't just skin deep. His soul had taken the hit as well, leaving a hollow feeling where his old self used to be. With a sigh, Gunnar pushed himself up from the chair, grimacing as his muscles protested. His body was healing thanks to Eli's efforts and the power of the Starlight Gem. But there was something she couldn't heal. The darkness festering inside him. The anger, the despair, the crushing weight of responsibility. It had always been there, but now it was becoming unbearable. He limped toward the window, staring out at the workshop grounds. The wolves were scattered about, patrolling, keeping watch. Alpha and Omega were close by, their eyes ever watchful. Normally the sight of them gave Gunnar strength, but now he felt nothing. Just a sense of emptiness, as if the fight had been drained out of him. He wondered how much longer he could keep pretending he had control. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Gunnar didn't respond, assuming it was one of the pack members checking in on him again. He didn't have the energy to engage right now, not after his conversation with Darren. He just wanted to be left alone with his thoughts. The door creaked open anyway, and Eli stepped inside, her presence calm and quiet as always. She didn't speak immediately, instead watching him with those perceptive eyes of hers, the eyes that saw more than he was comfortable showing. "Gunnar," Eli said softly, her voice like a balm to the storm raging in his mind. He didn't turn to look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the wolves outside. "I'm not in the mood for another lecture about healing or rest, Eli." "I'm not here to lecture you," she replied, stepping closer. "I'm here because you're drowning in your own silence." Gunnar's jaw tightened. "I'm fine." "You're not," Eli said gently but firmly. "You've been carrying this burden alone for too long." He let out a bitter laugh. "What am I supposed to say, huh? That I'm scared? That I feel like I'm losing who I am? That I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep doing this?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and Gunnar cursed himself for the vulnerability he'd shown. But Eli didn't flinch. She simply stepped up beside him, her gaze fixed on the same view he was staring at. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said softly. "Not with us. Not with me." "I'm the alpha, Eli. The leader," Gunnar said, his voice cold. "They need me to be strong." "And you will be," Eli assured him, her tone steady. "But you need to let yourself feel this, Gunnar. The pain, the loss. You've lost more than just your arm and your eye. You've lost pieces of yourself." Gunnar closed his eye, the weight of her words pressing against him. She was right, but he didn't want to admit it. "It doesn't end, Eli," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Every time I think it's over, there's another fight, another battle. I can't escape it." Eli placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "You don't have to escape it. You just need to survive it." Gunnar shook his head, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "And then what? More fighting? More loss? When do we get to live, Eli?" Eli didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face for the truth he was hiding. "You need to talk about it, Gunnar. Not just with me, but with someone who understands. Darren is here for you. He knows more than you think." Gunnar let out a long breath. "He doesn't know this world." "He will," Eli said with certainty. "And when he does, he'll still be here for you." The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Eli's presence was a comfort, even if Gunnar didn't want to admit it. Slowly, he nodded, accepting her words, even if he wasn't ready to face the storm inside him yet. "I'll try," he muttered. Eli gave a small smile, the kind that offered a sliver of hope. "That's all I ask." With that, she turned to leave, giving Gunnar the space he needed. But before she left the room entirely, she paused at the door. "You're not alone, Gunnar. You never have been." As the door closed behind her, Gunnar sank into the chair by the window again, her words echoing in his mind. He wasn't alone, but that didn't make the weight any easier to bear. For now, it was enough to know someone was watching his back, even if he wasn't ready to face the darkness head on.